So I was in Turetsk, or near Turetsk, on the outskirts of Turetsk, and Hrodivka near Pokrovsk on the front line in the Pokrovsk direction. And these are two cities, Pokrovsk and Turetsk, which are under intense bombardment and the subject of assaults by Russian infantry. The Donbass situation is not going well for the Ukrainians at the moment. The Russians have been able to advance pretty rapidly in the last couple of months, despite very, very hot temperatures and very difficult fighting conditions. They've thrown manpower into the battle, and they have made several kilometers. And Pokrovsk is a very key, very important garrison town for the Ukrainians. Turetsk is a city that's almost been obliterated, but it's still important to hold on to for the Ukrainians, and they want to make sure they hold Turetsk so that Konstantinivka, which is to the north of Turetsk, and a really important road and rail junction, is not threatened, is not flanked by a Russian movement. But they are under serious pressure because they don't have very many reserves at this point. The Ukrainians have spread very thin. Their infantry has been really taken a lot of casualties. It's also, people just are tired, and they have to come back from the line for rest, and because they're sick or to care for parents or something like this. So they are really struggling in this situation to hold such a long front line with the Russians. And that is why the Russians are able to make these incremental advances. So I was with a drone battalion that were trying to defend Turetsk, and I was with the 47th Brigade, who have very advanced American equipment, including Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, who are trying to hold the line at Pokrovsk.
And can we just have a little look? I mean, you've got footage, haven't you, of that work with the UAVs and how they're trying to hold those defensive lines. First of all, where did you go exactly to see what they were doing?
Well, I was at a command center with the UAV battalion. I can't say exactly where that is because obviously they're operational security reasons. But they are slightly set back from the very front line, but they're sending their drones forward to reconnoiter where the Russians are advancing. And what the tactics the Russians were employing at this time is to try and infiltrate Ukrainian positions with 3 or 4 soldiers, and then join as a big group to attack when they have more forces.
Let's just have a look at some of that footage then, and maybe you could talk us through it, because were you seeing this as it was happening, weren't you?
Yeah, I was in the command center watching the feeds with the commander, the major, as it happened. So this is one of the small groups of Russian infantry who are trying to infiltrate Ukrainian positions. So we saw them moving in groups of 3 or 4, trying to get into Ukrainian positions undetected. This group had been already targeted by FPV drones, and they were fleeing a house that had been struck by FPV drones repeatedly and a mortar until it was set fire, and they were trying to creep into the woods and get to another intact house where they could take cover. And you can see this is the house that they took cover in, but obviously the Ukrainians could follow them on the drone feed, and they continued to hit them. And this time it was being struck by a 122 millimeter artillery piece. And the Ukrainians don't know when they strike these positions, if they're in a house, what the success has been of that strike. So they just keep hitting the house until it either is burnt down, or the Russians flee and go somewhere else. So it's a real game of cat and mouse, because they're watching these positions for sometimes hours on end to see if the Russians are dead or alive, or if they try and come out and sneak out. They're using all the hedgerows, all the foliage that they can to try and avoid. This is another Russian position which is being hit by FPVs. And what the Russians are trying to do is they're trying to sneak into some of these buildings, and they stay there, 3 or 4 of them, and then another group of 3 or 4 will try and go, and they'll try and mass in a particular place until there's enough of them, perhaps platoon or company strength, to then attack a fortified Ukrainian position.
And so they're literally picking off Russian troops in support of infantrymen, 100 meters away or so. Is that right?
Right, so the Ukrainian infantry are in other houses or other basements around these positions, and the Russians are trying to find a weak point that they can get in. And so sometimes the infantry are pushing the Russians into a particular building, and then calling in the FPV strikes. So we're sitting there, and you can hear the FPV drone pilots calling in what they see on their drones, and then the major will he'll look at a particular drone feed. He has several drone feeds to choose from on his screen. We're just seeing one of them here, but there's a big bank of monitors with different drone feeds on it. He'll pick up one that's particularly interesting, then issue commands as to whether to launch FPV drone strikes against a particular target. And they have a threshold for doing that as well, where they probably won't launch an FPV strike against one soldier, but if there's 3 or 4, then they'll definitely start trying to take them out.
You also met with the 32nd's deputy commander. What did he have to say about the situation on the battlefield, and especially about how the Ukrainian government is handling recruitment at the moment?
So the 32nd Brigade had been brought in to try and hold the line around Toretsk because before it had been held mostly by territorial defense and another brigade that was tired. And when that brigade withdrew, it created a weakness in that sector that the Russians were able to exploit. The Russians are fighting much smarter now. They're exploiting positions where there are weaker Ukrainian units rather than weaker fortifications. They're not looking at the fortifications, they're looking at the units and attacking those. And that's allowing them to flank stronger units with some success. And what the lieutenant colonel said to me is that he was frustrated with the Ukrainian government because they hadn't mobilized troops quick enough and they weren't mobilizing them successfully enough and in the wrong way, because he felt that the message that was getting out to Ukrainian society is that we need more troops because there are so many casualties. And he said that, look, it's not the case that everyone that comes to the front line is dying. During a campaign, 5 to 7 people might die, 20 to 30 might get injured, which ranges from serious injuries to very light injuries, but they need to go to hospital. And then others might withdraw from the front because they're sick or they're unhealthy, because they spent so long at the front eating unhealthy foods or drinking energy drinks all the time, which is what the soldiers there do. And they simply need a break. And so he wants the messaging of the Ukrainian government to change, to say, look, there's so many soldiers who've been fighting now for 2.5 years. It's your duty to go forward and to take up positions just to give these guys a break. But instead, the messaging seems to be that we don't have enough people because our casualties are so severe, or there is no messaging to counter that information. And so he's very frustrated that the motivation isn't there from Ukrainians. There's just a fear. There's just a tactic of fear to try and coerce people to go to the front, round them up, and not inspire them positively, but just terrorize them into joining.
And of the troops that you met that were there, did you feel that they wanted to be there? They hadn't been coerced, as you were saying, that he was thinking that he was fearing. I mean, did you feel that they had a strong sense of moral courage and reason to be there?
I think the troops that we spoke to did feel like that, but it's always a difficult one because you're speaking to troops that agree to give you an interview. So people that will give you an interview are more likely to be motivated. They want the world to understand what they're doing. So it's a kind of self-selecting process really there.
Really interested to also hear about your time in Hrovdivka. Can you tell me a bit more about what you did there?
So I was spending time with the 47th Brigade. It's this brigade that's very well equipped with US Abrams tanks and Bradleys. And they've been brought in to try and hold the line around Pokrovsk. They've been in some of the fiercest fighting. They were the spearhead of the summer counteroffensive, and then they were brought in to try and hold lines at Avdiivka. So they've taken very heavy casualties, but they're still being used because they have these very effective fighting vehicles, the Bradleys. And the Bradleys have proved to be very resistant even to drone strikes. They have a very effective gun, the Bushmaster cannon, which is very good at clearing Russian positions and making short work of any Russian armored fighting vehicles that they come up against. So they have been thrown into battle time and time again in some of the most difficult places.
On Thursday, the 8th of August in the afternoon, and a fast-moving situation has developed with Ukraine going over the borders into Kursk, the Kursk region in Russia. Can you tell us a bit more about what your understanding is of what's going on there?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting offensive by the Ukrainians. It's the first time that Ukraine's regular armed forces have crossed the borders. Previously, it's been special forces, it's been pro-Ukrainian Russian partisans that have crossed the border in limited raids. Now we see what looks like a mechanized brigade with engineering equipment crossing the border, supported by perhaps as many as 3 other brigades. Attacking and they're taking large numbers of Russian prisoners of war, so they've got the capacity to do that and bring them back. And they're obviously determined to press on. It's a very interesting, moving situation. We'll see, how ambitious this operation is, whether they intend to take and hold areas of land in a bid to divert Russian reserves from the Donbass area to the northern theatre, whether this is a serious attempt to hold on to Russian land ahead of any ceasefire discussions or negotiations, which would give them an opportunity to exchange for some of the Ukrainian land that's been taken by the Russians. So we're watching this very carefully, but it does look like a very serious commitment by the Ukrainians, a mechanized brigade across the border into Russia and quite close to a Russian nuclear power station as well.
And just briefly, what are your Ukrainian contacts telling you about this?
Well, they all say the commanders are keeping very quiet about what the true objectives are for this operation, but people are obviously speculating. I mean, Ukrainians are convinced that Donald Trump will win the US presidency, and they will be forced to negotiate on unfavorable terms. The Russians have the advantage on the battlefield now; they have the initiative, and the Ukrainians are trying to turn that around and make sure that they have a stronger position if they are forced to go to the negotiating table in November.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.